So, you saw the thumbnail and the title, so I don't really need to explain much about what this video will be about. But, I guess I should talk about something. So, I am an artist, or at least I'm trying to be, and one thing that I've enjoyed doing for the past few years is making characters. And another thing I enjoy is writing stories for those characters. In fact, it's gotten to the point that I've basically created this entire fictional world that all of the characters I've made live in. And yeah, I've been meaning to make videos which explore some of my characters and their lore and stuff. You could probably tell that if you saw my previous episode where it was exploring one of my OCs, Miru. Yeah, I had a bit of fun doing that. But today, I don't want to necessarily focus on any particular character. I want to more focus on the world they live in. So think of this as just a simple video to get a good idea on how the world and stuff looks and works around my characters, so because I feel like there isn't really any other way for me to get this information across. So basically, if you saw my previous video, you'll know that it focused on 3 of my OCs, which were Mr. Funworks, Dr. Hines Harrington, and Miru. And these are only 3 of the many different OCs that I have yet to introduce and talk about. A lot of them just being simple side characters with not much interesting stuff about them, to others which are a bit more relevant to stories and stuff. I haven't made what you'd consider a series, since it's more like a bunch of different characters, all with their own separate stories and stuff. I guess I could sort of turn it into a series or something, but there wouldn't necessarily be a main character to focus on. But yeah, anyways. So, the world that my OCs live in, I've come to call the Fractiverse, and that's because the characters I've made live in entire multiverse. Some characters live in one universe, some others live in other different ones. Also, apologies if I mumble or stutter or something. This isn't really a scripted thing. I just sort of wanted to, yap about some stuff. So, the reason I call it the fractal verse is, those things called fractals, right? Where it's essentially just an infinitely repeating shape or pattern of shapes. Basically, imagine that one square or shaped one. I forgot what it was called, a sponge something, whatever, that one fractal that's a bunch of squares. So imagine that every single shape that makes up that pattern is its own universe, and it just continuously repeats on and on forever. That is essentially how the fractal verse is built. as for what exists in the empty spaces, I'll probably explain that in another video, but there's also some pretty interesting stuff to find in those areas. Anyway, I guess the best place to start about talking about the Fractalverse is how it first came to be, since I have like a sort of origin story for how it first started. Well, not necessarily a very beginning, but you get the idea. So, long before the Fractalverse was what it is now, there were only two universes, one being the first universe where physical living creatures lived, and the other being the first spiritual realm, I guess. The way the Fractalverse heavily revolves around living things and spiritual things, like a yin and yang. One cannot exist without the other. So, the living realm looked basically like a giant grey desert full of dead-looking trees with a single large star or moon or something that lit up the entire place. And it was basically like that. It looked like that infinitely. Like it wasn't like a giant globe. It was just like endless grey plains of dead trees and stuff. And in this world, there only existed one creature, that being the Shapeless. These creatures would basically go on to be like the very center of every single living creature that exists in the Fractalverse. They were capable of taking on whatever form they pleased. However, most of them at least, were never like fully satisfied with how they looked. Some of them wanted a more permanent solution, like staying in one specific form permanently, or stuff like that. Then in the spiritual realm, the first ghost-like entities, I guess you could consider, were the Tulpas. They took on, well, assuming you know about Tulpas, they don't have like a physical form unless certain things occur, and the Tulpa were able to cross over into the living realm where they could interact with the Shapeless, and they were able to like form bonds with Shapeless, so that the Tulpa were able to take on like more physical forms. Like if they essentially became the ghost equivalent of Shapeless, they were able to take on whatever form they pleased as well. And yeah, and eventually some of the Shapeless and the Tulpas decided to get freaky, I guess you could say, and that resulted in a new kind of species, that being the Immortals, which are basically like the gods of the Fractalverse. They were similar to the Shapeless and Tulpa, however they sort of existed in a state between spiritual and living, so they were like able to cross over into living and spiritual planes. they also had like the power to manipulate reality and stuff. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So anyway, the shapeless, obviously, was still, some of them weren't satisfied with their ability to change forms. The tulpa came up with this idea to make some kind of artifact which would essentially allow the shapeless to take on like a specific form permanently. And, well, of course, not all of the shapeless wanted to do that. You know, it was completely up to them whether they wanted to do it or not. But, you know, some of them did use it, and yeah, they took on the permanent forms, which they weren't able to change back from. And yeah, so it seemed really happy and stuff, you know, everyone's good, right? Well, not exactly, because after a while, the shapeless sort of lost interest in the tulpa, which, you know, made them really upset because they weren't able to take on their own forms if they couldn't form a bond with the shapeless. So they decided to do this thing where now if a shapeless were to take on a permanent form, they would like lose all their memories and stuff. And eventually the shapeless figured that out, and one of them lashed out in anger and tried to like attack a tulpa, and the tulpa, in self-defense, struck down the shapeless, killing it in the process. And because of that, something in, I guess you could consider, the code of the world broke, and the world essentially shattered into infinite amount of pieces, causing the shapeless to get scattered all over the place, and the spirit realm essentially like filled in the little gaps that all those pieces left. But like before they filled in the gaps, there were like these essentially like pockets or something, which were essentially just absolutely nothing. And if any of the tulpas or shapeless got sucked in there, they would just never be seen again, like they just stopped existing or something like that. And yeah, so the tulpas and the shapeless got scattered all over the place. So what happened to the shapeless is sooner or later they all took on permanent forms and forgot entirely what they were before, and then they basically went on to create all of the creatures that exist in the Fractureverse today. So like literally any creature, all of it can be traced back to the shapeless after like years and years of breeding and stuff. And in the Fractureverse, that is essentially like the whole thing about the shapeless not fully being satisfied with a certain form or whatever. That is essentially like the Fractureverse's explanation for why you got like people who suffer from body dysmorphia and such. That's like traces of the shapeless left behind in their brains and stuff. As for the tulpas, some of them, they all sort of split off into like different spiritual creatures, such as like demons, angels, shades, and other sorts of things. Some of the tulpas evolved to a point where they didn't need like a host or a bond with a living creature to take on a specific form. And others turned into like more abstract concepts, like what many people will imagine a tulpa as today, simply being like a thought form that's been given free will and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically what happened to the Shapeless and the tulpa. And the immortals were obviously really disappointed in their parents for messing up their entire world, so they decided to do like the reasonable thing and pick up all the pieces and try and fix everything. And so they took all those infinite pieces, scattered them all around the place, that were scattered all over the place, and they built it into that giant fractal shape that I was talking about before, which is why the Fractureverse is called what it is. So, yeah. Majority of the a majority of the immortals mostly like just maintain the Fractureverse, since it's infinite, so they need to make sure everything's like in check. Some other immortals decided to become like gods for various religions, and then there are also others which just wanted to cause like mischief and stuff, which will actually be important later on when like I introduce some like antagonists to the series, basically. And yeah, and I guess I could like explain what ever became of the empty spaces between the Fractureverse, but I'll probably won't go in depth on it. I'll probably like go more in depth in like a separate video. So while the Fractureverse was being made, some of the immortals obviously wanted to like fix everything, put all the pieces back together, or just rearrange them in a way that made sense, while others just, wanted to goof around with their powers to see what they were capable of doing. So the immortals who wanted to fix things and the immortals that just wanted to goof off decided to like make this agreement thing where they would leave like these big empty spaces between the universes where they could just like mess around and stuff, and that became what is known as the Between, which to sum it up is basically my world's equivalent of the Backrooms. It is simply an endless labyrinth of various liminal space photos, which actually, if you've seen that video I made about Scrabble, that he's actually like a character that exists in the Between. So, all those like liminal spaces and stuff like Gary's mod maps, or just like stuff you see on the liminal space subreddits. Basically, the Fractureverse is an infinite thing of all those different liminal spaces that all sort of connect to each other. And yeah, that's basically the simplified version. There are obviously like things that live in there, but I'll probably, yeah, like I said, I'll leave that for another video. Now, let's get into more detail for what became of the tulpas. So, like I said, some of them branched off into separate species, that being the demons, angels, and the shades. And I guess this is the part where I explain how they work. So, the angels, you could basically consider like lower ranking immortals, in a sense. Like, imagine a hierarchy where you got like the immortals, then directly underneath them you got the angels, which act like their servants and stuff, and then at the very bottom you got all the other creatures that like originated from the shapeless, which will be referred to as like lesser beings, just, yeah. One group of angels specifically, which I've made, are known as the Enamati, which is actually the Greek word for one eye, because they only have one eye. The way they work is say now, you think someone is doing something like unholy or some crap like that. Basically, you'd summon an Enamati, and you'd use that to like spy on the person, basically. So like they're essentially the ones that are used to help keep an eye on the people, like to make sure they're not up to anything bad, and if they do anything bad, they'll like report it back to whatever told them to spy on them. And they don't necessarily need to spy on someone to see if they've done something bad or not, necessarily. Like, they could just spy on them. They're also able to turn completely invisible, and their floating eye heads are able to disembody from their heads, so they can like fly around and stuff, and it'd just be like a eye. They are often seen in like places that are usually heavily associated with the immortals. One of the places you could find the Enamati are in the between. Again, I'll make another video going into detail about that. And yeah, now there are like probably other angels and stuff but I haven't like necessarily come up with any lore and stuff for them. I probably will in the future or something. Yeah. And now we move on to the demons. Now, the thing about demons in the Fractureverse is that they aren't necessarily like the bad guys per se, because like basically everything in every living creature in the Fractureverse is kind of neutral. Like, not neutral, I mean like there can be good and bad members of every species. Even the immortals have their good and bad members of the species. But so yeah, for the demons, they aren't necessarily like evil or something. Since they are relatives of the tulpas, they also have that thing where only take on the forms if certain things, if certain expectations aren't met. But the difference between the demons and the tulpas is that they essentially take on the forms of like the worst parts of a person. So like for every creature or thing that exists, there is a demon, which is a physical representation of the worst possible traits of that creature. And all the demons like take on a bunch of different forms and stuff. Like I remember this one idea I had for a story. I don't know if I'll like work on it or if it'll ever truly see the light of day, but it was basically where I explored how the demons work and their culture and stuff. So basically they got several like dimensions, which I guess you could consider like the underworld or something like that, where all the demons and stuff live. And so what's interesting is, you know how all different cultures have their own depictions and stuff of like demons and stuff. So basically all demons have like different forms that all relate to different depictions of them. So there will be some that'll look like, you know, red horned men with little tails, and then you'll have like more abstract concepts or whatever, like a dude in a suit or something. That would actually be really fun. Me, like, imagine there's just like a ton of demons going around, and then there's like just one member of the group that's like just a guy in a suit. And obviously there are other forms the demons can take, such as like the Chinese depictions of Onis and stuff, or there can be like other depictions of the from all kinds of different cultures and stuff. So the underworlds that they live in are like a big mishmash of various cultures and stuff, which, you know, if sounds kind of cool. With jeez, I really sound like I'm just self-glazing myself. I probably should, but yeah. Anyway, now the lost species that the tulpa branched off into are the shades. Now, not much is really like known about the shades. All that's really known is that they mostly take on the form of like shadowy figures. So think like the Hat Man and whatever other shadow monsters exist in various cultures. Now, sometimes the immortals will take on forms that can be like considered similar to the shades and stuff. So like you could, like I said, with you know, the Hat Man and stuff, there could be like, you know, in an in-universe explanation, basically like the Hat Man is actually just like an immortal who likes trolling with people after they enter sleep paralysis or take too much Benadryl or whatever. Yeah. So obviously, because the immortals are related to the tulpas, obviously some of them might have like similar traits to angels, shades, and demons, and stuff like that, because they have tulpa blood, or not necessarily blood, but, in their genes or whatever. And, yeah. So, not much is really known about the shades, other than, they take on the form of, like, shadowy figures or other things, and they mostly just seem to like tormenting and messing around with people. And if a person is to, like, come in contact with a shade, depending on, like, how long they've come into physical contact with them, they will start experiencing, like, intense hallucinations, which mostly just involve seeing, like, black or red fog surrounding them, with, like, lots of loud screaming and stuff, and also, like, potentially other stuff, like, seeing something run past the corner of your eye, or seeing something that looks like it's trying to attack you. Yeah, so the shades just love tormenting and causing chaos to the living, but they're not really as common as the tulpas and the other, like, the angels and the demons and stuff. And like I said before, some of the tulpas sort of stayed the way they are. However, like, their mechanics and stuff shifted. Like I said, some of them went from what they are now into, like, more abstract concepts. Like I said, what people normally depict tulpa as, and then some of them almost sort of became like emotional parasites or something, where, like, depending on the person or whatever, if they feel a certain emotion, a lot of times there is a chance that a tulpa could, like, latch onto them and feed off of that, but of course it's not harmful necessarily, but, like, if it started feeding off of anger or fear or something, then it probably, wouldn't be the best person to hang around with. But yeah, and like I said, it doesn't necessarily happen to everyone. There is, like, a small chance of it happening, but when it does happen, there is like, a good chance that the person will essentially, like, get a brand new friend out of it. Like, he could, oh, you're super depressed, oh, don't worry, there's this guy here now that you can relate with, yay, best friends. or like, hey, you're super happy or something, oh, don't worry, now there's someone who will be there with you to have fun and goof off and be best friends with, yay. But then, like, oh, you're super angry, oh, well, great job, and now there's a guy that you're stuck with, who's just as big of an asshole as you are. So, yeah. And that should wrap up my introduction for the Fractioverse and the, like, more important species that exist in it. I definitely will make a few more videos exploring, like, other creatures and stuff, like a lot of the lesser beings and stuff, and also, like, the robots and stuff and whatever. But I think this is like a good place to stop. You know, it was a nice, simple introduction and introduce, like, you know, the important species and characters, and yeah. Again, like, sorry for her, like, my mumbling or stuttering or whatever. This wasn't scripted. This was just meant to be like a funny yap session of me talking about the stupid fictional world I created in my head and all the characters that live in it. You know, just one of the many side effects of having autism, I guess. But yeah, also sorry for like any noise in the background. And I think I heard like a few dogs barking outside or something, and also my computer is still making that noise. I don't know if you can hear it now. Maybe if I like stop talking, you'll hear it. Yeah, you hear that? Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. I think I'll try and figure out how to fix that, but I don't know. Hopefully you're able to like tolerate it. It's not like super noticeable if I keep talking and stuff, but anyways, yeah, I really hope you found this video interesting, and if you want to see more videos where you want to watch me yap about my characters and the world they live in, then feel free to subscribe with all notifications enabled, you know, since I'm quite active on my videos, shorts, and also like community posts, because I feel like not a lot of people really pay attention to that. So yeah, I just want to let you know, if you're going to subscribe, have all notifications enabled, and you know, you can always undo it whenever you like, you know, because it's completely free, and if you decide you don't like my content, you can always unsubscribe, which, you know, I prefer if you don't, but if you like really don't like my content, you can always do that. Jeez, I've been talking for way too long. Anyway, so yeah, I hope you enjoyed this stupid little video of me yapping about my OCs and their world, and I'll see you in the future, whatever that might be. Probably like some animatic or something about another one of my OCs or something. But that's gonna do it for now, and I'll see you again. Bye.